Good evening. Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Carnegie Library Lecture Hall for our mid-local event with Kosoko Jackson, author of The Forest Demands Is Due. Thank you for joining us. My name is Seton, and I serve as Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. Thank you to our partner, Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, whose beautiful home we are in tonight. We also thank the Regional Asset District and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts for their support. Our friends at Whitewell Bookstore are here with signed copies of Kosoko's books for sale. After the program, Kosoko is happy to personalize your books. If you simply would like your book personalized, please form a line here by the PANL banner. And if you would like to buy a book as well, you can come here to get your book and then join the line that will queue around the building here. Tonight, Kosoko will be in conversation with Dr. Nicole Peeler, director of the Writing Popular Fiction program at Seton Hill University. She is a proud member of the League of Reluctant Adults and an alumni of both Boston University and the University of Edinburgh. We are thrilled to host the wonderful and Lambda Literary Award winner author Kosoko Jackson this evening. His latest novel, The Forest Demands Is Due, which he will discuss today, is lauded by Kirkus Reviews as a bold addition to the queer dark academia stories. He is the YA novelist championing holistic representation of Black queer youth across genres. He works as a digital media specialist focusing on digital storytelling and email, social media, and SMS marketing. His work has also been featured on Medium, Thought Catalog, The Advocate, and in several literary magazines. Please help me give a warm welcome to Kosoko Jackson and Dr. Nicole Peeler.
Hi. Oh, is that close enough? There we go. We had to practice this earlier. Hi. Thanks everyone for coming.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Kosoko.
Hi, Nicole. I'm sorry, Dr. Peeler.
Yes. Do I need to refer to you all night as best-selling author?
I mean,
Kosoko Jackson?
No, you don't have to. It's worn off a little bit already.
Because he is a best-selling author as of last night.
Thank you. Number 59 on the USA Today bestseller list. Wow,
Yes.
I can't even say it right.
That's amazing. Tell us about your journey into publishing.
You want the long version or the short version?
Let's go the medium version.
I can do that. So I have always loved writing. I wrote my first story when I was 6 years old. It was about a group of kids who went into the forest and got eaten by a bear. I read it to my parents during like the commercial breaks of Wheel of Fortune, and they were like, "You probably need mental health treatment, but like we don't believe in mental health because we're a Black family, so we're not gonna do that." And I've just always written since then. Like I was the weird kid in high school who like I made quizzes for my friends, and based on their answers, I would like give them magical powers and like make stories about them. And then I went to college. I was an MD PhD candidate for a scholarship program with a focus on infectious diseases, and I flunked out of school because biology was not for me. And so my mom was like, "You have to do something." And I'm like, "I'm gonna write a book and get published." And she was like, "Lord Jesus." And then I just wrote. I wrote a lot of books over the next 3 years. I got my first agent in 2018, dropped her in 2019, got a new agent in 2019, and then the rest is history. Since then, I've published 5 books.
When you think about that little boy writing stories about getting eaten by bears
Yeah.
and writing stories about your friends, what would that little boy think about USA Today best-selling author Kosoko Jackson?
That little boy is still inside of me, and he's like very type A. So he would be like very much like, why weren't you higher on the list? Or also, why didn't you hit the New York Times list? But I think he'd be proud. I don't do pride very well. Like,
Right.
I'm still very type A, and I think I always expect more of myself. So it's something that I'm like having to really like accept and like take pride in the fact that there are very few queer, black, or queer and black authors that can have a best-selling title. I was the highest-ranking YA book, a young adult book on the list, and so like that's something to be accomplished of. And I think he would be kind of proud, but also be like, "What happened to these other stories that we always said you were going to publish?" And I'd be like, "One of those was a Harry Potter ripoff."
He should be very proud. And you have a huge, like already a huge backlist. And so do you want to tell us a little bit? I know a lot of you are here for the book that The Forest Bands is due, but you've written in multiple genres.
Yeah.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about your other books, your other genres, and what
Sure.
attracted you to them?
Sure. So I have written in science fiction and rom-coms. So my first two books were Yesterday is History and Survive the Dome. Yesterday is History is a love triangle about a boy who gets a liver transplant, which leads him to time traveling back to 1969 and starts a love triangle with a boy in 1969 and the younger brother of his liver donor who comes from a time travel family. And then Survive the Dome is a Black Lives Matter techno thriller about a dome that is put over Baltimore during the Baltimore riots of a killing of a black man and a journalist who teams up with basically hacktivist to take down the dome. I've always loved speculative fiction. Science fiction has been my bread and butter. It's how I got started reading. It's how I was a big Star Trek fan when I was a younger kid. Never Star Wars. I still don't really understand Star Wars. Like, if you ask me the difference between the Republic and the Empire, I can never get them right. So
I'm here for you on that.
thank you. Like, my boyfriend loves Star Wars, and I'm like, which one are we rooting for?
can
It's
tear
the
apart
Republic,
families.
right?
Right.
He's like, yes, the Empire is Nazis, Kosoko. And I'm like, oh. So I've always loved science fiction, and I think it's a great avenue for like exploring a lot of like real world social justice issues. I then shifted over to rom-coms almost at the start of the pandemic. I was tired of YA, and I was like, I want to write something completely different. And my agent was like, you have never written a rom-com in your life. And I was like, let's try it and see what happens. And so my first rom-com, I'm So Not Over You, is a fake dating second chances ex romance. It won the Lambda Literary Award this year. And then my second rom-com, A Dash of Salt and Pepper, is an age gap, close proximity romance set in a small town like Stars Hollow between a chef and a businessman.
What is a close proximity romance? I don't actually know.
Basically means that they're like forced in close places
Gotcha,
together, so they
gotcha.
both have to work in a very, very small, basically food kitchen.
Gotcha.
Food kitchen, wow. All kitchens are food kitchens.
Yeah. I mean, Hell's Kitchen's kind of like a torture kitchen.
That's true. And you had a second part of that question, which drew me to...
What drew me? What drew me? What drew you to these genres?
Like I said, I've always loved science fiction, and the romance was like, I want to write something different. It was
Okay.
a trying time in 2019.
Yeah.
And so I was like, let's try to write some happiness and some joy,
Yeah.
since rom-coms follow a very formulaic structure that every story ends with a happy ending. I was like, that would be nice to try.
Yeah. Tell us about The Forest Demands Its Due.
Sure. So this beautiful book right here follows Douglas Jones, who is a kid who is on trial for killing 19 people in a fire in an apartment complex. He did not do it, so he claims, but everyone believes he did. And he gets a mysterious offer from a headmaster of a boarding school in Vermont called Regent Academy that says, if you attend our boarding school, we will wipe your record clean. Turns out Regent Academy in this small town of Winslow, Vermont, which is basically like an Appalachia town in Vermont, is a school that's like a kingmaker school. If you know of DC, it's like Sidwell Friends, which is where all the president's kids go. If you go to Regent Academy, you're going to become like a UN ambassador. But the trick is that inside of Winslow, there is a curse. Any person who dies in the town is forgotten and stricken from everybody's memory, except for the descendants of the 5 founding families, and for some reason, Douglas. And he figures out he is there to defeat this eldritch horror that lives inside the forest that is responsible for this curse and is demanding a blood debt.
Exciting.
I kind of love it. It's
So-
definitely my best book.
So why did you go from romance to horror?
I contain multitudes. So my rom-com career is like my adult career. I can never settle on anything. Even in college, I switched my major 5 times. And in my young adult career, like I have always loved horror. I watched The Exorcist too young. I was 6 years old when I watched The Exorcist. My parents were like, this is a great movie, and like we want to expose you to like culture. And then for the next 3 years, I slept in my parents' bedroom until my dad was like, he is a grown man at 9. He needs to get out of our bed. So I've always loved horror. And I've just, my like putting my teacher hat on, because I'm also a visiting professor at Seton Hill, horror is a representation of all bad things that are happening in the time that the book is made. So if you read or watch horror and look at the time periods they are made, you can see that. Scream is a great example in how Stumacher, who is very much gay-coded, represents a lot of like gay panic. You can also see in Carrie the representation of like femininity inside of schools and the female power. And so I think horror is a great way to address real-world issues. The Forest Demands Its Due focuses really heavily on mental illness. Douglas hears the forest and no one believes him, to the point where he actually thinks he's psychotic. It also deals with a lot of academic privilege and the ideas of how we use black bodies as scapegoats and other POC bodies, and also, without spoiling it, who gets to write history and who gets to determine that. Additionally, it's kind of like a fun little note. I call the creature in here an eldritch horror, which is penned by H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft hated gay and black people, and so to have basically a gay black man defeat H.P. Lovecraft's creature, it's kind of like a fuck you to H.P. Lovecraft.
He was also anti-Semitic, just
Yes.
in case. Okay.
Just to like
Round it all out. Just to round it out. So ultimately, what I loved the book. I thought it was really fun. It's very YA. So I appreciated those moments when they're like, we are about to get ripped apart, but I want to think about this boy. And I was like, this tracks. I like this.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I thought the book was really about figuring out a way forward. Mm-hmm. And I just found that really interesting. I mean, I think especially at this moment in time, with all of the, America trying to deal with, the legacy of enslavement and white supremacy, and then what's going on in the Middle East right now. This idea of how do we move forward was, I thought, really interesting. And Douglas, his adamancy that like this has to happen. We have to move forward. Can you talk about that a little bit? I thought that was just really an interesting theme.
I love it when someone's like, here's the theme that you wrote. I'm like, I absolutely wrote that theme. That was intentional, every single page. So there are a lot of stories where like it's very colloquial, or like the black character dies, or where characters who are marginalized do not have a lot of agency in the story, and they're there as like plot points. And I'm stepping around this lightly because like part of Douglas's agency and how he gets it is like a crucial plot point, so I don't want to spoil it. But I wanted to write a story about basically a black kid who is more confident than I think most YA main characters that we see. I think a lot of YA main characters, partially for the storytelling, start off a little bit more passive in their stories, and I think Douglas starts off pretty active. I mean, it starts with him beating up a kid who called him basically a slur in the very first chapter, and very adamant about being involved and in the room where it happens instead of retreating away from that, which turns into a big trait of Douglas in the positive and the negative. I write YA books because I think it's really important to show kids that like there's other options. Books, again, putting on a professor hat, are windows or mirrors. They can reflect our life, or they can show us into a new world. And so to show black kids now, black queer kids, that like you can be the hero and you can also make bad choices and things can still end up fine, and to show kids that don't know about a lot of queer characters or queer people that queer people are more than just their single identity, I think is super important.
Great. And I love how all the forces in the book are like, no, really, we're not moving forward. And Douglas is just like, no, we're moving forward.
Yeah, he's very much like a battering ram.
Yeah, I liked it. So what would you tell kids who are interested in writing, or parents who want to support their kids in writing?
Writing, you don't write to get money.
What?
I know, it's shocking. And I'm very transparent about my money. Like, my first book deal was $7,500 for a 300-page book. You can quickly tally how much that was per page. This book, 5 books later, was $75,000, which I mean is 10 times as much, which is great. But that's not everybody, and I'm very privileged to get that and lucky to get that. Obviously, there's work involved, but like a lot of books selling is the right place at the right time. We see these great stories about people getting $1 million book deals, or TikTok sensations that are then go for like 7-figure book deals. That is not the norm. And I'm seeing a lot of people, especially because of TikTok, get into writing because they think they are going to be the next Colleen Hoover or the next Angie Thomas. There's only like room for like one of those a year. And you write because you want to tell a story. Now, I think there's another aspect that we as a society think that we should be happy with any amount of money that we get, in the starving artist trope. And I think there's a balance here, because there's no other career where we should be happy for getting a little bit of money like we expect from artists. And so writing is a business. So what I always tell people is write your first book for yourself and then edit, and all other books are written for the business. And sometimes that means making difficult business choices. At the end of the day, when you get your edit letter from your editor, it is your name on the book and you need to be happy with it. But you also have to think of choices about a career and a long haul. One book is not going to make a career. It's going to take many books, but one book can ruin a career.
If there's writers in the audience, what would you tell them, like, how, like, next steps?
If you're a writer in the audience, I would probably say that if you have a book already and you have finished a book and you think it's done, set that book aside for 3 months and read it again. I would also make sure that if you can easily pinpoint comp titles, which are like, if you like X, you will like this. That is a huge thing right now. Publishing is drastically changing. TikTok, the advent of self-publishing, and to be clear, self-publishing is a perfectly valid choice. It's a different choice, and you get different advantages or disadvantages. I want to be traditionally published because I am a little psychotic in that realm, and there's a status symbol from traditionally published. You also get more money generally. And so I view it as a career, but self-publishing is completely fine. But I would tell you that, like, you only get one chance to have your debut, and it should be a book that you are proud of, because you never are guaranteed another book. The average statistic is that more than 80% of writers will not get published more than 3 books. So you want to make sure you're very, very proud of every book that you publish.
Great advice.
I know it's a little sad, but I think we have too many rosy thoughts about book publishing that we don't have about other careers.
Yeah, 100%.
No one's giving you a rosy thoughts about welding.
Right. And you'll make more money as a welder.
Yeah. That's the other piece of advice. Maybe become a welder.
Yeah. Yeah, that's our advice. Don't do it. Do anything but. You covered a lot of ground there.
It's like I've done this before.
Yeah.
Just maybe.
So what are some of the lessons you wish you could have given to young Kosoko? Because I love that idea of, like, make sure you're proud of your first book. That's great. But what else would you have told?
Young Kosoko sent books out on submission that weren't finished. So in the publishing process, you basically write a whole book, you send it to an agent, and you're like, hey, I want you to take this book because it's going to make you a lot of money. And then they ask for, like, the full, after getting the first 20 pages. They read it, they love it, they want you to sign with them. I would only write 3 chapters, and then I would send it out to agents.
Oh, bless your heart.
Right, and then be like, to see how, like, the market was doing. Mm-hmm. But then sometimes you would get requests, and then I have to be like, thank you for this request. I'm about to get on a plane to Zimbabwe, and I'm not going to be back for, like, 3 weeks. And then I couldn't post on social media because I was in Zimbabwe as I would finish writing the book. None of those books got agents. And I would be like, why aren't I getting agents? Maybe because they weren't good because they were written in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. So don't do that. I also only used to write, like, white main characters. Now, to be clear, if you're marginalized or have a marginalization, you do not have to write your marginalization. There is absolutely no expectation of that. But all of my characters, according to my first agent, were, like, black queer coded anyway. She called me one day and she's like, I have a quick question as I read this book. Is this guy supposed to be black? Because he's very clearly white. And I was like, well, I mean, maybe. And she was like, is he supposed to be black, yes or no? And I was like, yes. And she was like, all right. And then she hung up. And then from then on, I've written, like, black queer characters. I'm going to be very honest with you guys. Writing marginalizations in books is a minefield to get through. Like, as someone who is marginalized, there is a huge diversity push in publishing. That diversity push is very shallow. Yeah. A good representation is that for the past 4 weeks, the New York Times bestseller list has not had a single person of color on it.
Right.
Barnes & Noble just published their best list of 2023 books. None of those people are people of color. They're only white men and women. Now, are there, of course, white men and women that should be on that list? Absolutely. But you cannot tell me there's not a single person of color who shouldn't be on that list. Right. And there's a lot of expectation that all of your books will be about marginalizations. I've had editors tell me, like, this would be a great book if this character was, like, more black. Which is like, what does more black actually mean? And you can't have that conversation with editors. They hold all the power. But on the flip side, it gets you in the door. And so I will never tell somebody not to do something or to do something. It's a hard field to walk. But I very much do believe in the expression, like, get in and get a seat and then make changes.
Yeah. Yeah, and publishing is such a strange industry because you're not guaranteed that next contract,
No,
right?
never.
But getting in the door is so important.
Yeah,
So
and
it's
hard.
It's bizarre. It's this bizarre paradox where you have to get into the door, but then you have to do this like strange walk.
It's easier to get accepted to Harvard than to get a book deal.
Yeah.
My agent, who's like, he is an exception because I think Jim is actually like the top YA agent.
And I know Jim, and he's an extraordinary
He's
agent.
very sweet.
He's
such a teddy bear.
he's dedicated to his authors in a way that a lot of agents are not.
He gets 300 submissions a week.
Yeah.
And he says that he asks for full requests, which is to read the full book, of maybe 3 of them. And of those 3, which is like 12 a month, he maybe offers representation to 0.5% of those.
Right.
So like maybe 6 books out of 300 a week that he would like, 300 a week at a year that he would offer representation to.
Yeah.
And it's even more hard with like, we came out of the pandemic, and so people used a lot of time then to write books. So they're querying books. A lot of authors with sales records, which means they had agents before, got dropped by their agents during the pandemic, which is again like, your next book is never expected. There are some agents that if you are not ringing in 6-figure book deals, will drop you because agents get paid on commission and they don't have time to work with people who don't, which I mean is part of the cycle of this business. So now you're competing with people, some even New York Times bestsellers, who don't have agents. It's very, very hard.
Yeah. Yeah. So back to welding. No.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Something I do not know how to do.
Right. So let's talk about what's coming up for you.
What is coming up for me?
I don't know.
So I have another young adult book that is coming out, I think in 2025. It is not finished yet. It has 1,000 words. And my editor was like, we need it in 6 weeks.
Okay.
And then that is a mess, but it follows kind of like in the horror genre. I don't even know if it's good. I pitched it to her over like lunch a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this is something I'm thinking about. She was like, it doesn't make any sense, but there's a nugget here. Write me 3 paragraphs. And I did it, and she was like, it still doesn't make sense, but I'm intrigued. I need it in 6 weeks. And I was like, great, Karen, thanks.
Amazing.
And then I just sold an adult dark fantasy to Harper Voyager, which I don't think I can say any more than that. I don't even think I was supposed to say that, but who's going to stop me?
Nobody. Is anyone from Harper Voyager here?
My editor's going to come bursting through like, your deal is done.
Right. Get out.
And that's it. Like, I had too many book deals beforehand, and I'm really like struggling with like keeping up with them.
Right.
I sell on proposal, which basically means that I don't write the full book. I write 60 to 100 pages.
Now he writes on proposal.
Right. Do not try to sell your first book on proposal.
Right.
You will hear from some people that it is possible. It is. There's a few who have done it. Mm-hmm. They should not be saying that. It's very funny how like they kind of whisper it because like everybody else in the industry, once you say it, they're like, oh, I can be that person. It's very rare. But I only sell on proposal because I also know myself, and if I don't have basically a lawyer from Penguin Random House leaning over my shoulder telling me that if I don't finish this book, they're going to sue me, then I'm never going to finish a book again. But that means that sometimes in Jim's benefit, he will basically say, I will sell as much as you can write, and I think I can do more than I can.
Yeah.
Significantly more.
You also have like 4 jobs.
I'm a teacher. I'm also a social media director. I think that's it. I'm a dog dad, which is
3
a
jobs.
very important job.
Yeah. So what do you want the audience to know about The Forest Demands Its Due before we go to Q&A with the audience?
The Forest Demands Its Due is pitched as a horror book, but I definitely think it's more dark fantasy. So I think if you are really squeamish about like horror and blood and stuff, I think the book will still be fine with you. There's obviously some of that in there. It also deals with a lot of conversations about privilege. So I think that from what I've heard from readers, is that some readers have really had to confront their own privilege from this book in some ways.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm sometimes looking at those avatars like, did you just write this to have a clever post? But I digress. But I really do think it's a good book. I think everyone, non-YA readers or deep YA readers, will find something to like about this book. I think it's my best book, and I don't just say that because like your next book is always your best book, because sometimes you're just phoning in a book because the contract is due.
Right.
I really do think it's my best book, and I think you'll enjoy it.
I agree with that. I enjoyed it very much. I thought the horror elements really work. The forest is terrifying, but also a great metaphor.
Listen, enough people had to join. It was in the top 38% of books across the country sold last week. So
There you go.
enough people enjoyed it.
Yes. Let's give a round of applause to Kosoko as a best-selling author, and then we will open up to for questions.
My friends are going to be like, you have to stop saying that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kosoko. Thank you, Nicole, for this exciting and important conversation. Now we are in our audience Q&A. If you have a question, Caitlin and Lisa will pass the microphones. Just raise your hand, and Kosoko will answer your questions. Again, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I think it's really extraordinary the working with all of the different genres you do, and just the output is just really something I haven't really seen anything like it. So I'm just curious, what's your process, and how do you not? I think many authors would just be too scared to do a lot of this stuff, to change genres, to put out a book a year or however many you're doing. How do you pull it off? How do you do it?
That's a good question. So I'll answer it in two parts. About being afraid, I think it really depends on your agent. I like to say an author is only as good as their team. My first agent, my very, very first book that got canceled for many different reasons was a YA historical. And my first agent was like, you cannot jump genres until you have written 3 books in this genre in order to have like a following. And I was like, that doesn't seem right. And so when I switched, my new agent was like, look, as long as I can sell the book, I will sell the book. The advantage of switching genres is, like, let's say one genre doesn't do very well, you can be marketed as like a new debut in this new genre. And so it like really helps you revitalize yourself. Not every agent is going to let you write what you want to write, and not every person wants to do that. Some people want to stay in horror their entire life. I get bored of a genre easily. If I have written what I think I want to write in that genre, then I'm like, let's explore something else. And I just have an agent that matches that. How I do it and not pretty much crumble is that I have a very prescriptive writing style. So when I come up with a book and it's going to be a book that I'm going to write, I write basically a log line, which is a 1-sentence definition of the book. I then write the dust jacket of the book to make sure I understand the story. I then write a 25-page synopsis to make sure I can absolutely tell the story from scratch. I then take that synopsis and break it up to chapters so I can easily be like, in chapter 1, this happens. And then I write my 60 pages. That all gets sent to an editor in about a 100-page packet. And what I've heard is that plus a marketing document that I make really makes it feel like a holistic story. And because I have everything planned out, I can speed draft a book in about 3 months. And then I rinse and repeat for other stories. What I try to do is, if I'm writing multiple books a year, is to not be in the same step with every book. So I'm drafting one, but I'm editing another. That's in the ideal world. Right now, I'm in drafting for 2 books. And I hate that because it's like 2 different pieces of my brain, and it's hard to jump from adult to YA. But that's how I try to do it. I would not advise this for anybody unless you you don't work a full-time job. I learned my lesson. There was a time last year I was drafting 4 books at once, and it almost broke me. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned that when you when you go to write, it's because you want to write a story.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also mentioned that in many of your stories there are like underlying tones of current social issues going on. So I guess my question is, when you go in with that idea that you want to write a story, do you have that particular social issue in mind already, or does that kind of just come along throughout the process and bleed through the pages?
That's actually a good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question before. I would say probably the social issue comes to mind first. And I think it really depends on the story. So for Survive the Dome, which was written in response to George Floyd, that was very clear to me. And then for my rom-coms, I write with the trope in mind first, and then I figure out what I want to talk about. So I'm So Not Over You focuses heavily on like classism, and A Dash of Salt and Pepper focuses on the ideas of like burnout. And so I figure out the story, and then I figure out what the issue is. In The Forest Demands Its Due, I knew I wanted to write a story about the racism inside of academia, and then I folded the story around that. I think that's a little easier for me because instead of trying to create a marketable story and then figure out how to pigeonhole in the social justice, I'm building the marketable story around it. It also depends on the type of story. So again, Survive the Dome is very Black Lives Matter, and so like every review is pretty much like, if you are anti-Black Lives Matter or anti-cop, you're not going to like this story. I think Forest has it a little bit more nuanced, and so people who might not be like, academia isn't racist, might still like the story, and so it really just depends on the level of social justice I want it to be. That was a great question, though.
Sorry, one more.
Of course.
Again, back to the question of all the different genres and you doing all these works at once. Who are some of your influences? What are some of the works that influence you? The people? I'm interested to hear.
One of the first books that I read and fell in love with was Atonement by Ian McEwan. I think that's his name. Who just said some really bad things recently about like representation and diversity, which I'm like, ugh, not you too. Alex London is a YA author of science fiction that I fell in love with. I read the Pendragon series, it's a 10-book science fiction and fantasy series, and I think that's what got me into this idea of like epic, sweeping stories. Currently, I'm really obsessed with Ryan LaSala. He's another YA author who, actually, funny enough, we're very close friends, and our books came out on the same day. I think those are probably my biggest influences. I don't read as much as I used to. Partially is because I am writing so much. When I do read, writing has become so prescriptive for me. It's like some screenwriters or filmmakers who like can't look at a movie without dissecting it. I only read a book now for like the first 50 pages to like understand a craft piece. And I really wish I could turn my brain off from that, but then I'm like, ugh, I would have written this differently, and then it turns me off of the book. I was also a huge Les Mis fan when I was younger. Like, the sweeping epics and, like, the romance of Les Mis, Victor Hugo influenced a lot of my writing, which I used to be a lot more literary. Instead, I've had to very much turn down the literary, like, purple prose in my book for YA. It took me a long time to get to this. If you read some of my first work, there would be, like, 4 pages describing like the house. No one wants to read that anymore.
So this is on genres. So you've said that you've jumped genres, wrote in different genres. Does that happen a lot with other authors? And so are there authors that you like that jump genres?
Yes. So I think that jumping genres, like I mentioned before, is partially a marketing strategy to revitalize yourself, because if you have bad sales in your horror, your next horror book is not going to sell for as much money. But you can market yourself as like an ingenue if you jump genre. Part of it is that, and part of it is like, I just don't want to do this anymore. I would say that Ryan, who I just mentioned, is another author who jumps genres. He's currently writing horror, and he used to write like YA rom-coms. I think a lot more YA authors are jumping genre because YA, young adult fiction, it's very much like the housing market crash of like 10 years ago. There are too many YA authors and too many YA books coming out, so it's harder to sell. So more authors are jumping to like the adult category and also a different type because you can revitalize yourself and flex your muscles. I also personally think that sometimes if you stay in a genre too long, you kind of get bored and repeat some of the same plot elements. And if you jump to a different genre, there's different genre conventions, and that's a cool thing to do.
Okay. So do you find that many of your fans jump with you?
That's a good question too. So I think, and I heard this from another author, authors can fall into 2 different categories. You're fans of the author because they write in a genre that you like, or you are fans of the themes of the author. I think my fans are thematic fans. I have never posed myself as someone who's going to stay in a genre for more than 2 or 3 books. The downside of that is that you can get people who have drastically different opinions about different books. So I've had some fans who take my science fiction and love it, but say that Forest is the worst book they've ever read. It's funny because I probably put more... There was definitely a blood sacrifice I paid for this book because it took a lot of my energy, and I think it's my best book. And I had one fan tell me like it's Kosoko's like second worst book, and I was like, I need to know which book is better than
worst.
Not the worst, the second worst, but I need to know which one is better. And I like jumping, and I like that idea because there will always be a book for you. So the trade-off is like, if you're just a genre writer, if someone doesn't like horror, they're not going to read you if you're a horror writer. But if I write science fiction, horror, contemporary fantasy, maybe you don't like 2 out of 3 of those, but you like the third one.
So you mentioned like the marketing of your books with this strategy with genres, and how much of your energy is spent with the marketing or the cultivation of the business part of being an author for you?
More for me because I work in marketing, so my day job is in marketing, so I'm a little bit obsessive about that. There's no author that is expected to do it, but I like to have more control over my marketing. It's part of what I talk about. So this is the last stop of my book tour. I just did a 8-city book tour. I paid for that book tour myself. It was $4,500. But that's something that I wanted to do because there is a value in going on a book tour and building relationships with booksellers. Booksellers are much more likely to hand sell your book if they know the author. And that was a huge advantage. Did I sell a lot of books on the book tour? I actually think I only sold like 120 books on the book tour, which is really not that many for how much cities I went to. But all of those all those booksellers have been like hand selling my books and know me by name, and so it's important to me from that marketing angle. Also because, and this is the sad reality of publishing, marketing sells the book, not the quality of the book. There are so many, as I'm sure all of you know, bad books that have been New York Times bestsellers and books that have been exceptionally written that flop. That is all because of marketing.
And I just want to come back to the genre thing. I think one thing you're really smart about is all of your books have a really strong romantic arc.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and then you're also dipping your toe in romance. So it's like a romance reader will follow you to any genre.
They won't follow this dark horror, but okay.
I know, like my friend Heather, who used to edit for Tour, she will, if there's a romantic arc, she will read anything. So I think you'll be surprised. And I think that's a really smart thing to do, is to have that like one key unifier, especially for like the most voracious reading genre ship. Is that a word?
Yes.
To keep them in the game.
I agree.
I think that's very smart. Good job.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm kind of good at this.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. This question's for both of you. Kosoko, you're extremely productive, and I think to any other writers in the room, it's like intimidating and inspiring. You talked about your process on like a zoomed out level. Could you talk about like daily or when you go to write, like anything that you recommend or works for you, what your process is like on that scale?
It's funny because I have really fallen apart on my like processes recently, and I've really had to go back to basics about like how did you used to write books. So it's kind of like a 3-step process. I make myself an iced coffee, and I have a little iced coffee maker. I am very big about mood, so I have a candle, and I bought like 80 of them because it's like the right smelling candle, and I set that candle. I also have noise canceling headphones, and so I put them on, and I listen to 2 specific albums: the Evermore album by Taylor Swift, and then Halsey had her debut album, the Badlands album, but the Live at Webster Hall version. And I write until those 2 albums are finished. And because I write fast, so that's easily 5,000 words for me. And that's the goal. I do that every weekend. On the weekdays, I just set like, I want to write 10,000 words this week. If I hit that on day 2, then I don't have to write anymore. Or if I hit that day 5, then that's how it works. And that's how it works for me. I don't write every day, and I usually fall apart about the 50 to 60% mark. I don't think writers have to write every day. There's this idea that you do have to, and no one can do that. Like, not even, like, people don't even work out every day. Some people do. Nicole does. But some people do. But you don't have to do that. I think it's really important to figure out what works for you with your time and your life. There's no right way as long as you're writing. But that's just how I do it, because it gets me in the mood, and then I know, like, there have been times when I've been, like, on the plane or at my boyfriend's house, and he starts playing the Evermore album. I'm like, you have to turn that off, because it's going to make me go writing. It's like, I'm afraid of flying, and so I hate flying. I'm very logical, and I'm science-minded. The plane is still going to fall out of the sky. And so I listen to Call Me Maybe. It's my, like, plain Euphoria song. But I listen to Call Me Maybe for the whole 6-hour flight, over and over again. So if I hear it anywhere else, I'm like, I'm in a plane all over again.
But I think, I think you can also speak to this as a teacher. I think what we see in our students is, students think there is some sort of a magical, like, if I just give you this set of criteria that you just, worksheets, right? If I give you the magic key to just writing a book, but any progress is progress. So when I get stuck, set a timer for 5 minutes and write for 5 minutes. And maybe that's all you write that day, but the next day you'll come back, you'll have something and you can build. So I think people get bogged down with having, and this is, the type A person in me recognizes a type A person in you. Like, I think we can get bogged down in perfectionism where it's like, well, if I can't write an hour, I might as well not write. And that is, you can't do that. I mean, unless you're a full-time writer with someone bringing you bonbons, which is my dream. You cannot do that. You have to write when and how you can.
Another thing that we say in the writing world, which is really hard to think about when you're drafting, is that books are made in edits. It is so much easier to edit a book, but you cannot edit a blank page. Like with this new book, I have no idea how to write this book, and it is paralyzing me. But I know I've written 5 other books, so it's very clear I know how to do this, but I have to get words on a page because it can be edited later. But if you just have a blank document, you'll never write. Yeah,
I think as writing teachers, we know the process is so important. And I think students, I see that with my undergraduates especially. It's like, well, when am I going to stop having to write rough drafts?
Never.
Exactly.
Never. You always have to write it. And they're always messy, and you're always going to compare your rough draft to the finished book that you did before, and like, why is it not this easy? And you're always going to forget it wasn't easy when you were writing this book 2 years ago.
Yeah, I so mythologize the writing of my first novel because it did feel very magical because I didn't know what I was doing, and I was just sort of like, am I doing this? Is this a book? What's happening? But it was horrible. Like, then I'm like, no, I literally cried in a GP's office in Scotland, because this woman was like, you seem stressed, and I melted down. And this was after I'd finished my PhD. So we do tend to constantly mythologize our own processes. And I think, this is why I was so excited to bring Kosoko on board as a professor. A lot of writers mythologize, how many things, every time I see a writer who's doing a TikTok and they're staring at the camera with beatific and some weird filter, and they're just like, if you don't love every minute of your writing, you're writing the wrong book, or these are my best friends, and what I go out and I sit with my best friends and they just speak to me, and I'm like, shut up. You are crying. So, this is not, maybe it is how it works. Maybe they're on a lot of Xanax.
Let me be clear. I hate writing. I hate the act of writing. I hate the act of sitting down and writing a book. I am a plotter. I love coming up with ideas. If I could get paid to come up with ideas, I would do them, but then I would be like, wait, you're going to write this idea, not me. I should write this idea. I love the idea of editing a book because I could really make it stronger. But no one truly loves every step of writing. And then when you see those things, that's very faulty advertising. And I also think it may be for book 1, but publishing will break you. And that's part of it. Publishing is a business. Publishing only cares about the bottom line. And you have to understand that you have to have some type of business mind also when you're writing if you want to survive.
Publishing is both an industry and a clown car.
All at once.
Yeah. I think that's where we should end.
Sure, unless there's any other questions, I think.
Oh, good.
One more? Do we have time for one more? Yeah, okay.
So I always have it in my head that somehow I came up with this phrase, there's no good writers, there's only good rewriters. How much of what you write is written down that very first time, or is it edited and rewritten?
I can actually give you a number because I do think about that a lot. For this book, I would say I rewrote about 15% of it. Some books just hit. My first rom-com, I didn't rewrite any of it. Some of them are just perfect. My second rom-com was a mess. I think we rewrote 60% of that book. I think the draft that I gave her was 200 pages, and the book ends up being 380. And then my very first YA, that was a mess. I think I rewrote 90% of that book. Never write a book that takes place in 2 different time periods and also has a love triangle. Never do that. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea. And then Survive the Dome hit perfectly. I think 100% of that book is fine, mainly because I wrote it in response to something. I was in my house during the pandemic in New York during this atrocity, and I was like, I have to do something. I cannot go out in March, so I'm gonna write a book. But I do agree with that. I don't think there are very many like good writers. I think we're all good rewriters, and we all figure out how to do that, and it's different for each author. There are obviously some writers who are better than others, and I think every book is different. I don't think my next book is going to be a mess. I already know that, and that's going to have to be written like 80%. But that's just part of the process.
Then one more quick question. So on the business side, were you ever at a point, maybe when you were coming up, that you said, I need to make this much, this many cents, this many dollars per word or per hour or something like that?
I mean, money is my favorite thing to talk about in the publishing industry.
Me too.
Every book. So every book, my agent and I talk about what is the floor that I will take for this book, what is the reach I will take for this book, and what is the average. So first book was $7,500. The second book was an option book, so there was no addition. There was $10,000, so they boosted it up a little bit. My 2 rom-coms were $20,000 because Berkeley, the publisher, only gives $20K for debut authors. Survive the Dope. I mean, First Amanda's Due was $75, which was up from $50, and then my new book is $100. I just kind of know my worth now. Like I have, and my next book will be even more because I have Lambda and USA Today under my title. Those all count for things. It really also depends on like the book and the market that I'm aiming for. I'm willing to take less to work for a better editor at a small house because sometimes you just want to be better. You want to grow as an author. I'm also very lucky that I have a full-time job and also a part-time job at Seton Hill. So money is not the driving factor for me, but at the same time, I have turned down deals and told my agent to tell them like, that's an insulting offer because I know like what I'm worth. Generally my floor, it really depends on each book. And before we go out on submission, my agent and I have a conversation and we decide what those numbers are. And they're different for every person.
And I think it's good that you've had relatively, especially your first books, relatively low advances because we're not talking about the amount of money a book makes entirely. We're talking about advances. So Kosoko has to earn that advance from sales, and then he'll make more money on top of that. And if you get $1 million contract and you don't earn out, you are screwed.
So for like a $75,000 contract for this book, I think I need to sell it 62,000 copies to earn this book out, which means I'll start making money, which also that's when the publisher deems you profitable because they're no longer paying back that money. Part of the reason why I was able to get these big advances on 60 pages is because all my other books have earned out. So, yeah. Which is important in publishing.
Yeah. It's really weird. Publishing math is like there needs to be a hashtag publishing math.
If you are a student at Seton Hill, I always teach a publishing math at the end of my lectures because I speak too fast. So my lectures are always 58 slides and are done in like 2 hours.
Any last questions? All right.
Let's
give a huge round of applause for Kosoko, USA Today bestselling author.
You have to stop.
Thank you so much, Kosoko Jackson and Dr. Nicole Peeler. Thank you. On behalf of the board, the staff of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, thank you for joining us this evening. Please join us again in 2 weeks on October 23rd as we welcome Mary Beard for our next 10 evenings lecture. Kosoko Jackson will sign books here in a moment. And if you're going to have your book personalized, you can just come here for the line. The line will start here and go outside of this door. And if you're like me going to get a book, go to the table here and get your book and then join the line, the end of the line after that. Thank you so much for joining us and have a good night.